Welcome back to educator.com. For the next lesson, we're going to go over quadrilaterals. Now remember, a quadrilateral is a four-sided figure. So any polygon with four sides is a quadrilateral. That means the four sides has to be straight sides and they have to be enclosed. Okay? So this is a type of quadrilateral. Any shape that has four sides, four straight sides, and no open areas is a quadrilateral. Now, special types of quadrilaterals are listed out here. The first one is a parallelogram. A parallelogram looks like this. Okay, it has two pairs of opposite sides being parallel and congruent. So again, opposite sides are parallel and congruent. Parallel means that they are slanted exactly the same way, right? So that they will never touch. If this line and this line were to keep going forever and ever, they're never going to touch, right? So that's what it means to be parallel. And they're also congruent. So, to show parallel, two sides are parallel, you can draw arrows like that. So then one arrow with one arrow here shows that those two sides are parallel. Then I can also say that these two lines are congruent. So I draw two marks like that. Remember, that means they're congruent. Then to show that these two sides are parallel and congruent, instead of drawing just one arrow, because one arrow is for these two, right? I have to draw now two arrows. So now I'm saying all the sides with two arrows are parallel to each other. And then to also show that these two sides are congruent, I'd have to draw two marks instead of just one, right? Because all the ones with one are congruent, so all the ones that have two are congruent. Okay, so this is a parallelogram. So again, opposite sides are parallel and congruent. These two sides are parallel and congruent, and these two sides are parallel and congruent. That is a parallelogram. Now, a type of parallelogram is a rectangle. A rectangle is a type of parallelogram because, right, parallelogram just says opposite sides parallel and congruent. Well, rectangle has opposite sides parallel and congruent. So it's a parallelogram with four right angles. So it has all the properties of a parallelogram, plus it has four right angles. Okay, so opposite sides are parallel. These are parallel and congruent, and has four right angles. Okay, so it's a special type of parallelogram. The next type of parallelogram is a rhombus. Now, rhombus, opposite sides are parallel and congruent, plus it has four congruent sides. Okay, so then all sides are congruent. So, again, rhombus is a type of parallelogram. It's not a type of rectangle, it's a type of parallelogram. So then this is that, and then parallelogram with rhombus also. Now, the next one, square. We know what a square is. But square is also a parallelogram, but more specifically, it's a type of rectangle, and it's a type of rhombus. So square is like all of the above. Why? Not only does it have parallel and congruent sides, it also has four right angles, and it has four congruent sides. So the square has this one, it has this one, and it has this one. Okay? So that is a square. And then the last one, the trapezoid. Trapezoid is not a parallelogram. Now, remember, parallelogram has to have both pairs being parallel and congruent. Trapezoid only has one pair. So that means only this and this one are parallel. Okay, one pair of parallel sides. And that's the only requirement for a trapezoid. Okay, only one pair of parallel sides, it's a trapezoid. Two pairs of parallel sides, and it's a parallelogram. So then these are obviously not parallel. If these two sides were to keep going on forever, then they're going to eventually intersect, or they're going to eventually meet, right? So this cannot be a parallelogram. Okay. So let's look at this flowchart. This right here is a parallelogram. So we have parallel, congruent, these two sides being parallel and congruent. So this is a parallelogram. The two types of parallelograms this is a rectangle, and this is a rhombus. By the way, when you have more than one, rhombus is singular, right? When you only have one. When you have more than one, it becomes rhombi. So rhombi is the plural for rhombus. So rectangle, rhombus, two types of parallelograms. Because the property of parallelogram, as long as it has two pairs of opposite sides parallel and congruent, then it's a type of parallelogram. So this one is also has that property. This one also has that property. So this one has to have 4 right angles. Then it's a rectangle. So this one has all the parallelogram properties, plus it has 4 congruent sides. So 4 right angles. 4 same sides. Then, when you combine all of those properties together, it actually becomes this, a square. So notice that a square has 4 right angles, right? And it has 4 congruent sides, 4 same sides. So a square is always a rectangle. A square is always a rhombus. So a square is always a parallelogram. Now, parallelograms are sometimes going to be rectangles and sometimes going to be rhombi, or it can just be a parallelogram, right? Same thing here. Rhombus can be a rhombus, or sometimes it can be a square. So when you look at this flow chart, if you're going downwards, meaning you're comparing a parallelogram, let's say, to a rectangle. Isn't it only sometimes? So parallelogram is sometimes a rectangle because it can also be a rhombus. So when you're going down on the flow chart, it's going to be sometimes. When you go up on the flow chart, isn't a rhombus always a parallelogram, right? Because the rhombus always has the properties of a parallelogram. So if you're going up on the flow chart, if you're comparing like a rhombus to a parallelogram, a rhombus is always a parallelogram. A square is always a rectangle because it always has 4 right angles, right? A square is always going to be a rectangle. So this is always. Now let's look at, let's say, a trapezoid. Now a trapezoid doesn't fit anywhere on this flow chart. Why? Because it starts off with parallelogram, right? Parallelograms have to have 2 pairs of parallel sides and congruent sides. Trapezoid only has 1. So trapezoid goes over here to the side. Parallel sides, okay, that's a trapezoid. So is a trapezoid ever going to be a parallelogram? No, they're 2 different things. 1 pair of parallel sides, 2 pairs of parallel sides. Trapezoid, parallelogram, never. A trapezoid to a rectangle, never. Okay? So then, on the flow chart, if you go left or right, how about rectangle, rhombus? Are they ever going to be the same? No. So this is never. So again, when you're going downwards, it's sometimes. It's like classifying, let's say, animals. Let's say quadrilaterals is like animals. Parallelograms are types of quadrilaterals. So let's say parallelograms are like dogs, right? So parallelograms are like dogs. Well, don't we have different types of dogs, right? We can have Maltese, we can have Chihuahuas, we can have whatever, any types of dogs, right? So the different types of dogs can go there. And then from there, we can classify it even further, right? So that's kind of how it goes. If I go, is a dog always, sometimes, never a Maltese? Isn't it just sometimes, right? So again, when you go downwards, it's sometimes. But then again, is a Maltese always, sometimes, never a dog? Isn't it always, right? Now, if I go side by side, it's going to be never. So let's say on over here, where the trapezoid belongs. If I write birds. Well, birds and dogs, they don't have anything to do with each other. They're two different things, right? So if I ask you, well, when is a bird a dog? Never. So that's kind of how this flow chart works. So this is just an example. Okay? So let's do our examples. Give the most exact name for the figure. Here we have 4 congruent sides. Now, what has 4 congruent sides? We know that a square has 4 congruent sides, but then again, a square also has to have 4 right angles. So this can be a rhombus. This can also be a parallelogram, right? But a more exact name would be rhombus. How about this one here? Now this looks like a rhombus, but I don't know that all 4 sides are congruent. I know that these 2 are, okay? So all I can say, because all I notice is that these 2 are congruent, I do have 2 pairs of parallel sides, so then this is a parallelogram. And then the last one, okay, it looks kind of like a rectangle, but I'm not sure. So here, only 1 pair of parallel sides. I don't see that any of the sides are congruent or the same. Okay, no, it doesn't seem like any 2 sides are the same. That's all I have, right? Just that it's parallel, 1 pair. So then this must be a trapezoid. Okay? And just because it looks like a rectangle doesn't mean that it is, right? Looks like maybe this side and this side, they're not parallel. This side looks a little bit longer than this side, right? So we can't really assume. So just based on the facts, this being parallel to that, and that's it, it would be a trapezoid. The next one, if a parallelogram has 4 right angles, then it is a... Now, what do we know has 4 right angles? We know a square has 4 right angles, and a rectangle has 4 right angles. But isn't a square a type of rectangle? So then this has to be a rectangle. Because if I say rectangle, then I'm also including squares, because a square is a type of rectangle. A rhombus is a type of what? Yeah, it's a quadrilateral. But more specifically, it's a type of parallelogram. If a quadrilateral has 1 pair of parallel sides, then it is a... If it's 2, then it's a parallelogram, right? 1, then it's a trapezoid. Okay. The next example. Okay, always, sometimes, or never. Let's see. A trapezoid is always, sometimes, or never a rectangle. So remember that example where I said trapezoid is like a bird, a rectangle is a type of dog, right? So trapezoid, a bird is never going to be a dog, right? So it's going side by side on the flow chart. So it was trapezoid here. You know what, let me write it in red. Okay, so then the flow chart starts off as quadrilaterals. We have trapezoids here. We have parallelograms here. Then parallelograms, the two types are rectangles and the rhombus. And then these two have a square. So here's your flow chart. Now again, if you're going side by side, meaning if there's no arrows connecting them, then it's never. So quadrilaterals is like saying animals. Trapezoids is a type of animal, so it's like a bird. And then parallelograms are like dogs, right? Then they branch out to the different types. So we said Chihuahuas and Maltese, or whatever you wanna say. And then this can be, I don't know, maybe a type of Chihuahua or something. So that's kind of the idea of the flow chart. Now trapezoids, the birds, can never be a type of a dog, right? So this is never. A rhombus is always, sometimes, never a parallelogram. Maltese is always, sometimes, never a dog. Isn't it always? Right? So if we're going to go up, then it's always. A rectangle is always, sometimes, never a square. Well, rectangles can just be a rectangle, and sometimes it could be a square. And is a square always, sometimes, never a rectangle? Because a square is a type of rectangle, it always has to be a rectangle. Okay. And that's it for this lesson. Thank you for watching educator.com.